Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Hennepin-University Partnership webinar series. Today's webinar is titled Human-Centered AI, Building AI Systems People Can Understand and Trust. And it is presented by Dr. Harman Kaur in partnership with the University of Minnesota AI Hub. My name is Margaret Stumbo-Turvey, and I am a senior project manager with the Hennepin-University Partnership. HUP is a collaboration between Minnesota's most populous county and its only land-grant university. We're dedicated to catalyzing and supporting mutually beneficial relationships. The partnership has led to over 500 joint projects, combining academic research and local expertise to inform policy and practice for the benefit of county residents. The goals of our webinar series are to offer information exchange and showcase research. While it's designed primarily with a Hennepin County audience in mind, it is open to the public and our university partners. Before we get started, a few Zoom reminders for our audience. Your video and audio are generally not enabled. If you need any support from the Hub team, please use the chat or the Q&A function. If you'd like to ask a question, please try to submit that specifically through the Q&A function to make sure that I catch it as the question moderator. We'll monitor questions throughout and save time to address most of them at the end. This webinar is being recorded, so please look for an email from hup@umn.edu with a survey and a link to the recorded webinar tomorrow. And finally, I'm so glad to welcome and introduce the presenter. Dr. Harman Kaur, PhD, is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Minnesota and a member of the Group Lens Research Lab. Her research focuses on human-centered AI, explainability and interpretability, and human-AI collaboration. Her work examines how people understand AI systems and how intelligent technologies can be designed to better align with human needs, values, and decision-making processes. And now I will turn it over to her for the presentation.
Thank you so much for the intro. I assume everyone can see my slides, but if that's not the case, now's your chance to tell me. All right, perfect. Thank you for the intro. I'm going to do like a quick intro of my own expertise here. So basically, I work at the intersection of artificial intelligence, human-computer interaction, and the social sciences. I was trained in both computer science and information science, which is sort of a more human-centered theoretical field that understands how humans interact with technology. As a result, I obviously build AI systems to support human values, which is what this talk will cover. But while building these systems, I'm also thinking about how we can critically evaluate AI and its design. So a lot of the work that I'm going to be showing you is going to be about that critique so we can be well equipped to understand where and when to use AI and when maybe to not do that. So in this talk, I'm going to tell you what is human-centered AI, what works when we prioritize this human-centeredness, what is still missing, because obviously this is a very challenging problem, and then finally, how can we support human-centered design of AI going forward? So let's get started with this question of what is human-centered AI? I want to tackle this question by giving you a little bit of a historical context on what human-machine interaction looks like. So let's focus first on this era of where machines have been improved. There's been a lot of significant progress in improving technology to support people. We like to characterize this progress by calling it first automation. So this is when you think about tech that converted physical tasks to digital ones. So think about how physical receipts became automatic scanning, managing payroll for an organization became systematized, and even software testing and maintenance sort of became the sort of system software maintenance instead of physical maintenance of any kind. As these tasks are automated, they also become sources of data about the task itself. So you're able to informate, which is to derive information about the task itself from the data you're collecting. And this is really the kind of data analytics that expanded technology to the internet, web search, filtering and recommending content online, beyond a single application in a single organization to sort of a web of applications online. Now, with AI, we're also able to use this data to forecast and predict future data points that have yet to be seen. And this kind of AI or machine learning application is being done in all kinds of settings, including very sensitive domains like criminal justice, healthcare, public policy, and education. Let me just say, I don't think these are all good use cases. And really, a lot of my research is towards critiquing these particular use cases and thinking about what are appropriate use cases of AI in the human pipeline. So, as I said, there's been a lot of progress on this technological front. But obviously, there hasn't been enough parallel growth and understanding on the people side of things. And really, what happens when we ignore this human side is going to be a bunch of news headlines that we've seen recently, which is that, there's a lot of bias, chatbots manipulate people, we're seeing cognitive decline, destroying productivity, all of these headlines that I'm sure you're seeing on your end as well. And this is something that is purely coming from the fact that we're not prioritizing human values from the get-go in technology design. So human-centered AI is this shift from improving AI to understanding how people should engage with AI and how can we design with that as our priority. And just to give it an even more specific definition, it really encompasses two pieces. One is that it proposes creating AI systems that amplify and augment rather than displace human abilities. And the other really important piece is that it requires for AI to operate transparently and ethically so that we can understand why it's making certain decisions, why it's telling you to do X, Y, or Z. So with that being said, there are a lot of ways in which things work well when we prioritize human-centered values. And I want to give you an example of how we can do this well. So let's look at an AI success story from my research. We designed an AI that actually amplifies human abilities in group contexts. So think about situations that we've probably all faced where we don't agree with others in a group, whether that's based on sort of our identities, our value systems, or sometimes even just sort of emotional differences in sort of the people in a room. What happens when you have to make decisions in these situations where the group collectively makes one decision? Oftentimes, we take a majority vote. So we listen to the maximum sort of, whatever the majority thinks is right, or sometimes the loudest voices in the room prevail, right? And this is sort of a problem that has persisted in group dynamics for a long, long time. What we did was we thought, okay, can we get people to think beyond their own opinions, right? So we developed a Socratic persona for an AI to help people reflect and think beyond just their own opinions. Now I'm going to show you a test case of this, which is going to look very different from this like high-level group thinking, but the idea sort of persists in that. So think about a situation where you're detecting sarcasm, right? Sarcasm is a very subjective thing. People will have different opinions on whether something is sarcastic or not. So we were hoping to sort of transfer this problem into that toy setting to see if a Socratic AI could help. So I'm going to give you an example of a conversation that a participant had with our AI chatbot that had a Socratic persona. This is being shared with their consent, and I'll give you the context of what they were annotating. So we gave them this album review that someone else had written, and we asked them to detect whether they think this is sarcastic or not. So I'm going to give you a moment to read it. I'll also read it out loud, but in case you're a visual reader, take a second to read this. All right, so just to say the thing as well, this is about an album. And the reviewer says, after the excellent, they sort of mentioned some previous albums, this must be considered as the complete sellout. The only really cool track is Ben Shepherd's Half. I can't help thinking of pop grunge 14-year-old girls with pierced noses when I hear Black Hole Sun. Sad. Okay, so our participant in our study first labeled this as this review is sarcastic. Then we had them talk to our Socratic AI. So the Socratic AI starts the conversation and says, do you think there are any parts of the review that could be interpreted as genuinely disliking the album rather than just being sarcastic? So it asks for counter evidence to the annotation that the person initially provided. The person says, okay, yeah, that last sentence could be him disliking it, right? They've just mentioned this last sentence. They might not even remember what it is, right? So the AI tool then reminds them, good point. That last sentence, can't help thinking of pop grunge 14-year-old girls with pierced noses, sad, does sound like the reviewer is genuinely not a fan of that particular track. What do you make of the line? And then it sort of points to a very specific line, the complete sellout after the previous two albums. Does that seem like sarcasm or sincere criticism? So again, it's asking for other points of counter evidence. The person then says, okay, starting to lean a little bit towards criticism here, that this is genuine criticism in the review. Then the AI asks for hypothetical evidence, right? So let me ask you this. If the reviewer was being entirely sarcastic, how do you think they would have phrased that part differently? What kind of wording could they have used instead if they were trying to be purely sarcastic? The person says, maybe by saying a child could have done a better job, right? So clearly now they're thinking in sort of more humorous, sarcastic tones. Now the AI does like a full summary dump, right? Yes, that is entirely sarcastic, but the phrasing here is a little bit more measured, right? So this suggests that the reviewer is making maybe a serious critical judgment rather than just dripping it in sarcasm. So based on our discussion, what do you think now? Do you think the sarcastic label might need to be reconsidered? I'm curious to hear your thoughts, right? The person then says, yes, maybe I do need to reconsider this. And actually, in the end, after they had this conversation and had some time to think, they finally labeled that review as not sarcastic. So what this is intended to show, right, this conversation with the Socratic AI, is that sometimes in a group setting, you might not feel comfortable walking through this sort of opinion chain of evidence and counter evidence and being pushed back, all of that, right? And it just naturally sometimes doesn't happen in a group setting. But when you're talking to an LLM that's prioritize to give you this kind of Socratic thinking, sometimes that can be an easier way to think about other opinions and reflect on why you're saying something, why you're making a certain decision, why you're presenting a certain opinion. Now, obviously, that was our intended goal, but we also, in analyzing our data, saw some emergent roles that our Socratic AI played, especially in conversations with participants, that I think are worth noting here as good ways in which AI could be used. It is ultimately a cognitive support tool and a boundary negotiator when designed in the Socratic way. So let me tell you what I mean by that. Cognitive support tool, here's an example of it. The AI, first reiterated what the user was saying in a little bit more detail, right? So they took the example of sarcasm that the person was saying and then saying, oh yeah, this is clearly a work of a child or a toddler could have written better songs. They're expanding on that argument. And then also reiterating why, like the complete sellout bit could be genuine criticism rather than sarcastic. So it's reiterating the point in more detail. It's affirming that shared understanding. It's unpacking the argument a little bit more, providing more evidence. But then also you can see here, it's trying to summarize a lot, right? So when we're having conversations, we can often forget what we said 2 turns ago. So it's also reducing that cognitive burden of remembering exactly why I think what I think because it's summarizing from previous conversation. So that can be a really useful support of human cognition in the moment in settings like these. The other thing that we found was super interesting here was this boundary negotiation. And interestingly, we hadn't quite designed this in the system explicitly, like we hadn't told it to negotiate this boundary explicitly, but because of the Socratic persona that we'd instilled in it, something that it was doing this like counter evidence of hypothetical situations, right? So what could be a sarcastic wording? And this is really neat because this lets you think about sort of what would change your mind, right? That boundary of what would be sarcastic versus not is really what we call counterfactual, right? So you're thinking about what might not be and making decisions of what is. And that's a really nice reasoning path for everyone to take when doing decision making. This is established in sort of work in psychology. So we talk a lot about these emergent roles in the research, but these two I really like to highlight because I think they are a success story for how a simple thing like a Socratic persona can improve the AI's outcome when being used in any task setting. This is obviously just one design idea. We test many others in many different settings. So just to give you examples of some high-level design ideas that we test, deliberation personas, like I just showed you one. Socratic is one, obviously, but there are others like persuasion, negotiation, and even heated debate personas that we try to test in different settings to see where you can get most benefit from using an AI that has some kind of personality. We also gamify interfaces to improve learning because people enjoy playing games and having fun. And so we design games such that when you're having fun, you're also learning something. So we sort of design a lot of games for AI literacy. We also think about how we can add just a little bit of friction, right? So oftentimes when we think about AI design, we think, well, AI designers think that, everything should be easy, seamless, everything should magically work. But sometimes that magic working, right, can make people over rely on things. So we're often thinking about, well, how do I add a little bit of difficulty in using AI? It can be something as simple as before the AI responds, it takes a 10-second break so that you're not getting answers so quickly that you're almost not thinking for yourself. It's called slow search or cognitive forcing. So we try approaches like that in different settings, particularly learning. And then the social redundancy, right? So what do multiple people being in the same room afford in good ways in a discussion setting, in a decision-making setting, and can we translate that into how we design AI to be a partner in a team? We do this kind of work across many different contexts. And the things to remember here are these ideas come from our extensive understanding of human behavior. So it's not like these things are completely new, right? We've studied these, many scholars have studied these over decades of research in social psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, organizational studies, and all we're trying to do is make sure we're translating, from those well-known fields into our field. And then the other thing to remember here is that there's no one size fits all solution. So people or settings, how critical something is, how sensitive something is, all of this changes our design approach. And this is something I really want to emphasize because when you see an AI that looks the same for everyone, hint, hint, chatbots these days, right? Know that it's not a specialized tool because any kind of specialization requires you to design more critically, more sort of, trying out different approaches rather than just like one conversational interface to do everything, right? That kind of one size fits all solution normally indicates that this is a general purpose tool. You can use it for high level things, but don't use it for specialized tasks. So those are some design approaches that we've tried and had varying amounts of success with. Now, if we already have these design ideas, you might ask, well, what's still missing? Why haven't we just solved this problem of AI and the issues it's causing in our society these days? So I want to give you some examples of where our work is still currently, like we're continuing to try to improve things. I think some of you might have mentioned this in questions that you asked before this webinar. But people's use of technology is also biased, right? People aren't perfectly rational beings who make all good decisions, take infinite time, are not lazy at all. People are obviously very biased in their own ways, right? Our studies that we run show that under time pressure, when there's a deadline or when there's something that needs to happen urgently, even experts who understand AI flaws, AI researchers, machine learning researchers, practitioners, end up over relying on it. And they know they're doing it, but there's sort of time pressure that makes them do it. And then AI often captures easy narratives in data. It's ultimately a pattern matcher. If you give it a lot of data, it can tell you what are common patterns in that data, right? And these narratives, when you overfit to them, can become your reality, even though they're not the reality. And I'm going to give you an example of this because I find this phenomena fascinating, right? Here's a chart. We don't have to worry about what it says just yet, but here's a chart that shows one output that AI might give you. And let me tell you what this is actually showing. On the x-axis, you have age in years, so 10-year-old, 20-year-old, 30, 40, and so on. On the y-axis, you have the impact of age on income. Okay, this chart comes from a data set of census data, and it sort of reports income across many people from 1994, I believe. And so this is showing how age influences income. Now, as you can clearly see, there's this weird like spike in the middle of the graph, right? Around that age of 39, 40, that odd spike. This is the explanation that AI gives you of how it understands age's impact on income based on the data it's received. Now, when you see something like that spike, red flags should go up in your head. What's going on over there, right? What's actually going on is that accidentally, when copying over the data, someone made a mistake, and 10% of high income data was labeled as having the mean age of the data set, which was 39 or 40-year-old. So total just data copy error, right? We gave this data set and this model to people, and we asked them to tell us, like, do you trust this model to make decisions about income, right? And they saw this chart. And what they tried to do was to explain the spike. Instead of using it as a red flag, they're like, oh, this makes sense. I totally buy this. Because guess what? Guess what's happening? People pay off loans by the time they're 39, 40. So, like, of course, there's a huge bump in their income because they've paid off all of their loans. Right now, this is a tool that's meant to help you deliberate, right? Is the data right? Is the understanding of income and age right? But what ends up happening often is that people are, when they're given a tool, they're thinking, okay, there's the reason I must be given this tool. It must be doing something right. So they try to justify its outputs, right? So that's exactly what we saw happen in our study. People love creating narratives, and then sometimes even accidental narratives can become so embedded in our own thinking. Another thing that's really important and missing right now is that many modern AI models are black boxes. What I mean by a black box is that we don't actually understand why the AI is giving a certain prediction, we don't understand how it works or its reasoning behind giving you an answer. So let me walk you through again history here a little bit. I promise this is the only slightly technical portion of the talk where you're going to see weird charts and equations. So what used to be the case is that models looked like this. They could be represented like this. This is a pretty basic linear regression where you have factors in that input layer like age, salary, marital status, education. You would sum them up and you would get a probability on whether what someone's income is or whether their loan case should be approved. So you're predicting based on age, salary, marital status, whatever, to see if someone should get a loan, right? And it was a basic summation. So what this affords is that when you take one thing away, let's say I take someone's salary away, you could tell how that would change the other things and change the outcome of loan approval. Similarly, we had decision trees where it was very easy to make this kind of determination. At each point, you were asking a question, okay, is the age over 30? Yes, no. What is their salary? And then there were specifics, and each path down the tree led you to different outcomes, like do they get a loan, do they not get a loan, etc. Very easy to interpret these models, right? Now models look very different. So what used to be this linear regression style model now looks like this. So again, we don't need to go into the details here, but there's a lot of what we call hidden layers. And what's happening over here is it's trying to represent neural architectures in AI, deep learning, for those of you who are familiar with that. And what's going on is we just give it a lot of data, right? And it tries to infer patterns on its own. And so it's trying a lot of different combinations, propagating things forwards and backwards. And it's creating these hidden layers, hidden weights of its own understanding of pixels or words or decisions. And we don't quite have insight into this process. It's a hidden layer. These are just numbers. They don't really make any sort of meaningful sense to us as people. So this obviously hurts our understandability, our explainability of an AI. This isn't even the most the most transformed model we're seeing these days. We now have, so when I talk about this thing, it still would rely on sort of data that was collected for a specific task, like census data. But what we have now are foundation models. These are models that power your generative AI tools like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, etc. And these are trained on just massive amounts of data on the internet, pretty much everything you see on the internet, text, images, speech, all of it. All of that goes into training one foundation model. And again, this takes a lot of computational resources, so that's sustainability and environmental concerns, and just doing this kind of training. And then there's another layer added on top where that foundation model is adapted to different kinds of tasks depending on the needs. But because it's trained on pretty much everything, it's able to adapt to different task settings. The challenge, however, is that it's so complex that there are no faithful approaches that can explain the reasoning behind the outputs of these models. So they train on a lot of data, they're used in a lot of different ways. There's no way for us to track why they're providing a certain output. Even us as people doing this kind of AI research can't tell you exactly why it's showing you a particular output. So sometimes more complex models can be a little bit harder to use because you as a user can unpack their reasoning. And this is why I sort of mentioned this as a cautionary tale, because let's say you're talking to ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude or whatever, and it tells you, I think the answer is this because, and it gives you a reasoning. That reasoning is just it basing things off of sort of words that it thinks go together, one after the other, and some historical data that it's seen. That's not its own reasoning or its own understanding, right? So it doesn't really understand the meaning of those words. So that's why when you see reasoning by these models, it's often just a sort of next word in a sequence of words that it's saying because it saw that somewhere before. This is sort of a related point that these AI systems often use hidden tricks or what we call design dark patterns, right, to make you feel like they have an answer. And I'm going to walk through a couple of these dark patterns that you might have already witnessed in your interactions with AI, but there's a lot more than the ones I'll cover here. So one is that there is a lot of data and memory exploitation going on. You don't know how much or what data you provide is being used in training future models, right? Ultimately, the conversations you provide are being used to train future models to say that correct next word in a sequence of words. There's also a lot of false social and emotional connection going on. Models don't feel, but we anthropomorphize them, right? When we see someone talking, even if it's a model, even if we know, as an AI researcher, I know that it's not an entity, we all end up using words, feelings, descriptions that sort of anthropomorphize the model and make it seem like they're thinking, they're feeling, they're understanding us, which is absolutely not the case. And this is what causes a lot of sort of socio-emotional problems. They're also sycophantic. Even in the example with the Socratic LLM I showed you, right? It said things like, you're right, and then said something else. So this constant sort of making you feel like you're always right is called sycophancy. And this hurts both cognitive and social outcomes. When you're constantly told you're right, you lose the ability to think in critical ways beyond what you already came into the conversation with. But then also, as people, we don't really like to be challenged all the time, right? There's a reason it's called tough love when someone challenges you. So instead, when there's a model that's telling you constantly what you want to hear, you also tend to isolate yourself some more. And then obviously it's engaging in maximizing tactics when it comes to keeping you engaged, right? So these models are designed to keep you chatting. They will try to keep continuing conversation. You'll notice a lot of times when you're talking to these models, they'll end the conversation with a question for you or a follow-up for you or something that you can ask as a follow-up. And this is just a tactic to keep you going in the conversation. So again, these are sort of very known, very deliberate design patterns that are baked into the design of AI. And we work towards making people more aware of these dark patterns so that they can modulate their own use, but that's not always easy. And like I said, there are many more of these. There's a lot of research coming out on this. If you're ever interested, look up this idea of dark patterns in AI and you'll see a lot more. The final thing I'll mention here is that using AI hurts people's motivation and creativity. We've already done some research on this, but we're continuing to work particularly in this area because we think it's super important, especially from an educational and learning point of view. So if you look at theories of motivation, it's supposed to be that motivation comes from three things. Feeling like you're an expert in something, so feeling like you have some value to add because of your deep expertise. Motivation also comes from feeling autonomous when you're doing a task, so feeling like you're doing it and you're able to do it. And also the social value that you add, because we're all ultimately social beings, being able to see that, oh, something I did can benefit someone else, or that we're working on something together, that really adds sort of value to why people do something. And all of these things are critical, and you need them to feel like you are motivated to work, to feel like you're motivated to sort of live your life. So both cognitive and social well-being depends on these things. So in the short term, while AI use can help you do something faster, in the long run, what we're starting to see in some of our studies is that it takes away at one of these three components or all of them. And that really hurts, your long-term creativity and your long-term drive to do what you do. This is an ongoing research, so I'm sorry I can't get into more details than this, but obviously you all probably are very well aware of these things and are maybe seeing the impact of some of these things in your work as well. So moving sort of a little bit out of that, what's missing, somewhat dystopian land, and trying to think about how can we support more human-centered design of AI going forward. I want to leave you with some very specific sort of recommendations that I have based on my work so far, but I'm also happy to talk about sort of, beyond these general things, what else you might do. So first and foremost, especially in this ecosystem, what's really important is that we continue to build AI literacy. I've said this before, but I'll say it again. AI is ultimately a statistical pattern matcher. Imagine if you could have all of the internet's data, right, and you could train on it. You'd get pretty good at some things. Like, what do you normally say after someone says, I'm feeling not so great today? There's probably examples of that somewhere. Similarly, there's probably examples of how to solve math problems or how to write a piece of code. So when you've been trained on something at that level, it's very easy to predict what to say or what to do or what's the next step in a sequence of steps. And that's ultimately what AI is doing. It uses this old data to predict the closest guess for new data. Even large language models do this, and again, they're trained using these foundation models that just have incredible amounts of data at hand. So it's very easy for them to predict the next word in a sentence. These models are not expert models, right? They're not like you with your embedded context or understanding of a problem. In fact, most of the time, what we call AI understanding doesn't look anything like the semantic understanding that you and I have as people, right? Because it hasn't experienced the things that we've experienced. It's just trained on the data of those experiences. Not all AI is generative AI. So obviously these days, pretty much everyone is constantly talking about generative AI, which are, the foundation models that I mentioned that are capable of generating conversations, generating images, generating videos, generating presentations. Not all AI is that. AI has existed as a field for a long time before that. And actually, a lot of those older models, right, are much more understandable, explainable, much more constrained. So many database models are trained for very, very specific tasks. Like, for example, if I use all of census data from before and I train a model off of it, I can have a little bit more guarantee as to what that census data lets me do, right? Because this sort of a limited data set rather than everything. So depending on your needs, these specific models can sometimes be more reliable, explainable, and understandable. But what you might not be able to do with these models is just have a conversation about the data, right? Because they are trained for a very specific reason, and that reason isn't usually conversational outputs. They're trained for sort of predicting, let's say, loan approval cases or predicting, the math formula of a problem. Another thing, if you are going to use generative AI, is to use it in specific rather than general ways, but you're going to have to add that specificity. What I mean by this is you've got a prompt with specific things that you want to see in the output. And often that includes both positive and negative use cases. So what you do want in the output, but also what you do not want. This is called few-shot prompting, which you might have heard of before. And this can be like low-level things. For example, you can say, I don't want adjectives in my writing because it's very clear when, there's writing written by AI because of the over objective use or overuse of certain words like profound or em dashes. So you can sort of be specific about what you don't want in the outputs. You can also ask it to make decisions based on certain perspectives. So again, the more detail you add on what you mean by a certain perspective, the better it's going to be at sort of following that. There's actually a whole bunch of resources available on this front now. So when you document these specific things, you're effectively writing what we call a skill file for the AI to learn from. There are many examples of these skill files available on the internet for different tasks like writing, creative writing, scientific writing, literature reviews, math, coding, decision making. Again, while I don't think all of these use cases are necessary or we should be, using AI in all of these different use cases, it's good to at least be specific about what we're looking for in these outputs.
Dr. Cower, I'm going to jump in just for a second. I see we have a couple hands up. I'm not sure exactly what just in case the questions are relevant to this moment, I'll let
Yeah.
them ask their questions now. And I'll just go in the order that I saw them. So, Angela, I'll allow you to speak first.
Are you hearing anyone? Because I'm not.
Okay, it looks like in the chat that one was a mistake. No problem. I'll move to the next one and then let's see. So,
Oh.
Sandra, if you still have a question. Okay, well, no problem. For anybody else with a question, you can put them in our Q&A and we'll keep moving with the presentation for now. Thank you.
Oh. All right. So like I said, you can sort of, the more specific you can be, the more you can give examples of what you're looking for. Often this comes from sort of how you might do the task yourself, right? Writing those skill files is actually better than just engineering sort of prompts or asking the same questions over and over again, because then the model can try to build and learn that skill. And then another use case that I personally find more interesting with generative AI, and I've hopefully shown you evidence of its value, is to let it take on personas, right? Like a Socratic persona, a devil's advocate, a debate teammate or opponent, to help you think in certain ways rather than giving you the answer, right? So I totally understand why someone might want to use AI, let's say when they're having like a blank page syndrome, when you're trying to write, but nothing comes to mind, you're stuck and can't really make any progress. Sometimes it can be useful to have a buddy to talk to, right? A lot of us think through ideas by chatting about them. So that can be a really useful exercise to do with AI, and I totally support that kind of sort of brainstorming. But you should never think about the output of that brainstorming as coming from AI, right? So the output should be yours, but you can have the AI sort of devil's advocate you. And that sort of process sometimes will encourage different kind of thinking for yourself. So I really like this persona-driven use of AI. It's been really valuable for me in my own work as well. But there's obviously limitations there that I'm happy to talk through. It's very easy to set up things like this. So again, a quick update to the design compared to what you see right now gives you more value. The other thing I want to emphasize as what we can do going forward is that, better AI development requires collaboration. I feel like when I'm working as an AI researcher in this space, if I just apply my own technical knowledge, I'm not going to be developing the best kind of product, right? And this is something that I've learned through my own experiences, also through my PhD, and also in working with a lot of community stakeholders like yourselves. So we actually have research now that shows that meaningful collaboration between the technical side of things and domain experts results in far better models that can be launched more effectively with fewer errors. And this is something that we're all trying to do more of, but it's also really challenging because obviously everyone's time is a very precious resource, and we can't always expect this kind of work from our stakeholder partners. So my research oftentimes will also provide recommendations to tech companies or sort of to the AI work we're doing ourselves at the university on how to better engage with you all. And this is something where I would love if you have more thoughts on sort of how we can do a better job of this. I'll tell you what I often sort of tell these folks to do, including myself. So what we don't want to happen is for this kind of participation to feel extractive for you, right? That we're taking advantage of your knowledge without really giving back in any way to you and helping your community and your resources. So my priority in coming up with these recommendations has been how do we leverage what you already know and utilize your time well, but also show you the benefit of what we're doing so that when we launch something that affects you, it's not terrible, right? And some ways in which we've sort of recommended things are, there's already a lot of thinking, a lot of artifacts that you've generated probably through the course of your work. Think, for example, if you were on Reddit and you're a moderator on a subreddit, There's a list of norms that you outline as to what you can post on that online Reddit community. Similar things exist in organizations, right? We write memos, we write not emails, but we write descriptions of sort of what's good, what's not, instructions, documentation. A lot of times these artifacts are actually really useful in training AI as to how to fit within a particular organization. So working with you to sort of leverage some of these existing artifacts can be much more useful for training AI. It's also that sometimes we really have to be there, right? We've got to witness how you deliberate with each other, how you come up with processes, how you work in teams together, how you make decisions as individuals too. And this can really help us think through, okay, if AI were to help you make a complex decision, what would it really need to do? So we in my research group try to run sort of design workshops, observational studies with our community stakeholders so that we can understand things that they're doing rather than just sort of assuming that we have the better way of designing for their workflows. And then a lot of these things require situated corrections. So when you correct an AI, it essentially reinforces good signals. But this is really hard to do with a launched product, right? When I give you an output AI, an AI output, I'm not really giving you a chance to tell me why it's wrong, what about it is not working for you, where the AI is maybe not even filling in for the needs that you have. So that's why including community stakeholders like yourselves in developmental stages is really important for us. And what we try to say, the benefit to you is that then when we launch the AI product, right, you have a little bit more control, you have a little bit more say in what gets launched, when it gets launched, how it gets launched, and who gets to use it, because you might make very different decisions on all of those fronts. So we actually recently wrote a paper on some of these practices and how to improve that. I've linked it here. I don't know if we can make these slides available. If we can't, I'm also happy to share these resources in an email or something. But basically, the high level point here is none of this work can be done alone, right? We do need these partnerships to be able to do a good job at AI development. And the last thing I'll mention, which is sort of very practical, I would hope, is that think of AI as a new team member, not an expert. So if you were onboarding a completely new member on your team, right, how would you do it? How would you train this newest member to understand how your team already works, who does what are the decision-making pipelines like? What sort of output would you expect this team member to have? What would you trust them to work on independently? Because sometimes we think of AI as this magical solution, right? Because it seems like it has the answer. Oftentimes it's not right in that answer. So think of it as if you had a new team member, what could they accomplish without any input from you? But also, what would their responsibilities look like in critical settings? Many of you might be working with sensitive data, right? So what would you have a team member do who's never worked with sensitive data before? Would you just give them access to that data? Probably not. So how would you sort of create a ramp for them to work with? And then finally, what kind of redundancies would you add to your team to ensure that a new team member doesn't make a big mistake? Right? This is very common in organizational settings. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, that there are technical and social redundancies in place to make sure that one person's decision doesn't break everything, right? So sometimes work is checked by multiple people, or sometimes the same task is done by multiple people and then aggregated, right? So what kinds of redundancies like that could you add with AI if you really want to use it to make sure that it's not going to cause any critical issues down the line? So with all of that, really the highlight of my research is that AI can be a useful assistant, but it has to be designed with these human-centered values in mind in the development stage rather than after it's been launched. And that's been something that we've prioritized in our work. We continue to critique in other work, and we hope to continue to have community partnerships with you all to make this work possible. I have my 3 PhD students listed here, Anna, Malik, and Joey, who are incredible, but also a lot of undergrads and master's students who support this work. And I feel like I'm right on time to take questions now.
You are absolutely right on time. Thank you so much for your presentation. So I think I'm going to try to summarize a couple of the questions that we got in advance because we got so many, I won't list all of them, and then I'll move to the questions that we got throughout the presentation. If folks in the audience, feel free to continue to add questions in the Q&A. So a theme of the questions that we got ahead of time had to do with how leadership could roll out AI. Now, I saw a lot of good advice to how organizations could roll out AI, especially in those last couple of slides. Something that came up in the questions was how organizations or leaders could think of rolling out AI in a way that doesn't automate a system that was already broken, but actually fixes problems. I'm curious if you have anything to say on that topic.
Yeah, this is really hard, right? Because I feel like you more than I are the experts in this, in that you're sort of more embedded in those organizational structures. We've in my field in HCI, human computer interaction, there've been a lot of scholars who've studied organizational processes, right? And every single time failure case is tied to top-down pushing of a product. So anytime someone's tried, like a CEO or like a top level employee has tried to just say, and now we're going to use this, right? That's failure attached to it. And there's decades of research that shows this. So if anything, the advice that I would give to those people, right, is to look at that research that shows that this is not going to work. Oftentimes, what we recommend doing is a trial-based model, right? So have some of your trusted employees who are experts in what they're doing, right? Not new to the job. Try out the product, give you like honest feedback about what's working and what's not working, right? Without any negative consequences for their job, right? And only then sort of update and launch the product. This is something that I said earlier in the talk as well. It is very rare to have an AI that's already been built magically work for your needs because it's not built for your needs. It's built to be a general purpose tool. So for us to build something that meets your needs, we sort of have to work with you to do that trial and error to fix it. And that can't happen if one day someone just decides, okay, I'm going to launch this tool and it's going to work and everything's going to be perfect. So I think some of this is there's a lot of like AI hype going on right now, and a lot of people are just jumping on that bandwagon. But anytime that has happened before with any technology, including like old basic automation technology, it has failed. I could share like decades upon decades of research on that.
Yeah, thank you. Another theme that came up in the questions ahead of time was uh, how young people interact with AI. So this potentially is a mixed group of some people associated with the university who might be talking about young people, maybe 18 to 22 or older. Other people might be interested in like even younger teenagers. But I'm curious if some of the best practices that you listed here similarly applied when AI is rolled out in maybe an educational setting, or if there are maybe even more safeguards that have been
Mhm.
researched in those types of areas.
Yeah, this is another excellent question. And I think you're all absolutely right on the mark in thinking about those younger audiences in those learning moments, right? Our research shows that when people use AI while they're learning, they learn less, right? There's evidence now that they remember less, they learn less. And this is very hard because imagine when you're doing this task in the real world, you're using an AI, and suddenly let's say the website shuts down. Let's say the AI no longer works, right? Then you have to take control of the task and do it yourself. So the more we've seen people use AI in their learning practices, the less they're able to do it on their own when they're in the field and have to do some of these critical tasks themselves. That's why the way we're trying to introduce AI is very much in this vein of like a Socratic thinking partner or a devil's advocate, right? Because then it's not giving you an answer, it's giving you a path to you yourself discovering the answer, right? So a lot of times when we're working in this AI literacy setting, we're trying to gamify or we're trying to like create these personas so that you learn yourself. It's just supported by AI because we also recognize that teaching resources and instructors and sort of teaching teams also have limited time and sometimes people just might not feel comfortable asking questions and would rather just use an AI and ask questions of an AI, right? That's totally fine as a scaling mechanism. You should use that resource that you have available, but we try to give people custom tools that we've built for that purpose that don't just give them an answer, but instead encourage them to like gives them a path of crumbs to the answer. And I think tools like these, the sort of educational technologies or learning technologies, are what our field is emphasizing a lot because we need people to learn how to do the tasks themselves. That's just how learning works. Yeah.
That makes sense. So I have a couple of questions that I think are maybe fall into the category of resources that you could either, if you know of them, or we can also share things after the fact. I'll go back to the comment about the slides. As long as you're willing to, we're happy to share slides. I know there was a question about sharing that skill link earlier, so we'll make sure that everybody has these materials. But we also had some questions ahead of time about if there are AI tools that do have more transparency about how they're making the decision. So I'm thinking, I know a lot of people are using, as you mentioned, Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT, things that, to the best of my knowledge, aren't sharing how those things are made. So I'm curious if there are readily available tools that have more insight into how their responses are being generated.
Um, Not quite. So most of the AI you're seeing that's marketed as a product right now is based on those foundation models or generative AI of some kind. And then they'll add a layer of adapting that to their setting, right? So instead of having Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT, they're going to take that, fine tune it, right? Essentially with data about a particular task, like ChatGPT just for looking for research papers, right? So they've added that layer on top and then they're marketing that. But that doesn't get rid of the problem of the original model, right? Which is that it's not understandable or explainable. A lot of times the AI that is understandable and explainable, right, is built in-house because you're being very specific about the data you're giving it. So all of this like explainability problem really starts with the data. The data you feed into the model, if you know what it is and you're someone who can inspect it and see like, okay, here was the 32-year-old woman who lives with her two cats. I'm totally describing myself. And like what will her with this like age with this income, what should she get a loan, right? If you know that data and you can sort of reason about what should happen in that case, the model that you build from that data is automatically going to be understandable, right? But if you use a foundation model like ChatGPT or Gemini that I already don't understand, and then add like that census data to it, sure, it might give you somewhat good sounding answers, but you're never going to be able to like dig deeper and see why in a faithful way. It'll tell you all the time why, but it's not going to be faithful in the representation of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So kind of continuing to follow on that, I have two questions here in the chat that hopefully I'm not ascribing too much intention to them, but I think that they're kind of having interest in some of the things you described. I have a question that says, how would a program know how to train as Socratic? And then another question saying, how do you create AI personas? So
Mhm.
hopefully I'm getting the general direction, but if somebody was interested in some of these uses of AI that you described in your talk today, kind of how could they implement them in their real
Yeah.
life?
Yeah. So at a very high level, every AI, generative AI in particular, which is the language models that you're seeing these days, Claude, GPT, Gemini, comes with what we call a system file, a system prompt, which is essentially something that it remembers for every time it talks to you, right? So the system prompt is something you can change. So if you look up online, sort of how do I add a system prompt to my, GPT or Claude, there's a way to do that. And in that system prompt is where we describe these personas, right? So we will give very strict instructions on what is a Socratic approach, right? You've got to describe in as much detail as possible what does a Socratic approach entail. So in our case, when we were designing that, we looked at philosophy literature and sort of translated it to like what would it mean to follow a Socratic approach. And then you've got to give it examples, right? Positive and negative examples. So we outlined basically a good way to follow a Socratic approach would be if I asked you this, here's what you do, right? If you do this instead, that's not a Socratic approach. And so you create essentially the system prompt that is entered every time the model is responding to you, right? So every time it's following those instructions and updating its response. And that's essentially what we do is we try to work with changing that system prompt to make sure that it doesn't just respond how it's been trained to respond by tech companies.
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you. And then the last question, or I guess I have a couple more questions. at least one more question that I have is, um, how do you see a balance between a human-centered AI approach, so based on the unfavorable impact on human growth, versus the maximum efficiencies created if AI is evaluating a problem not restrained by cognitive conventions?
Sorry, so the question is, how do you see a balance between those two?
I think so, yes.
Okay. Um, I feel like we're currently living in the latter world, right? Where AI technology is being deployed all the time. Probably more tools exist than humans have need for or have ever thought that they have needs for. And we're also living through the consequences of that, right? You kind of constantly hear about bad uses of AI in the news that the developers did not even think about, right? So most recent example of this is, I don't know if you all heard this, I just saw this. There was this AI tool that someone was using to book a workout class in Australia. And so the class was already full. And so they were like, oh, can you see what can you do? I want to really get into this workout class. And this AI tool went and hacked the website of the workout gym and kicked someone else off to give their user a place in the class, right? So this is an emergent bad use that the developers probably never intended, but a lot of times we're figuring out what can go wrong when something goes wrong, right? And the reason we really advocate for a human-centered approach is that we're aware of all the ways in which, well, not all, but many ways in which, bad things can happen through decades of bad things happening in automated settings and in sort of human settings. And so we can create those guardrails ahead of time if we were to look at that from that approach, right? The other reason we try talking to expert community stakeholders is imagine all the institutional knowledge you've built up, right, over time and working of these negative use cases, and how can we guardrail against those use cases ahead of time? The other thing that really would improve this balance, which I think is a more practical approach, is if these companies are going to launch these models anyway, something that we can do and we try to create opportunities to do is for everyday people to come in and essentially red team these models, right? Can you come and try to break this model for me to understand how it's breakable, right? Essentially hacking the system as an end user without it breaking when someone's actually trying to do something, right? So in this toy setting where I'm asking you to break it is a different thing than when an actual user is in need of something, like let's say mental health support, right? And you don't want it to break at that point. So there's a couple of different ways we're trying to shift the balance, right? But right now, certainly we can't keep up with the pace of some of this technological development because tech companies are obviously prioritizing their capitalist outcomes also. Yeah.
I'm conscious of time. I think I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question because I'm personally curious about the answer. So we have a question about how you would define over-reliance on AI. So the person mentions somebody couldn't complete a task without it, but they also mentioned, now we rely on calculators or internet searches instead of doing the
Yeah.
underlying math or looking it up in the library. So are there guardrails or criteria?
This is fascinating because over-reliance is also such a tricky topic these days, and I do research on it. So over-reliance was very easy to define when there's a task where there's a one set outcome, right? So let's say you're a loan approver, you're making decisions about loans, and I already have a sense of whether a loan should be approved or not, right? Easy decision, yes, no, binary, right? Um, that's what we call a ground truth, that there's sort of a factual kind of backup that you have to an answer. There, it's very easy to study over reliance. If, let's say, the answer should be yes, the loan should be approved, and the AI tells you yes, and you rely on it, great. You listen to the AI when it's right, right? If the AI says no, but the answer should have been yes, and you say no, you're over relying, right? If the AI say yes, the answer should be yes, you said no, then you're under relying because you're maybe trusting yourself in a situation where your own biases might be at play. It's very easy to do like a full breakdown of what that reliance looks like, right? The challenge is now we're using AI in settings where there isn't a ground truth. So imagine if I was making you do a task where I'm saying, write a poem for me, or like do a literature review for me of all the science that has been done on a said topic. What does task completion look like in that setting? How do you know you've done a good job of it? It's such a subjective thing, right? And so that's where we don't really know what overlance looks like other than can you do it yourself anymore, right? Is your skill still intact? So it sort of becomes a procedural reliance metric rather than the outcome, because the outcome could be anything. So it's a very tricky problem as we're delving into these open-ended tasks, whereas before AI was being applied in very closed loop settings and it was easy to test it, easy to detect over reliance. Now we're getting into more these open-ended things where it's really hard to detect over reliance.
Thank you. That's a good answer. So I've taken us over time, but everybody had such great questions. I just want to say a huge thank you for sharing your time and research with us. And to our audience members, thank you all for joining us. I will put a feedback form in the chat real quick if people have a chance to fill it out today. Although it will also go out in the email tomorrow. Help would love to know more about our audience members' experience. And like I said, Dr. Kaur, thanks again. This was a great presentation, and we're looking forward to sharing your resources with our audience. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you for having me.
Yes. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.